spoke here on March 24th, 2011 on the topic of immigration, surprise, and then in 2012, education and immigration reform. Then you did, in October of that year, talk and film presentation on sleep dealer, immigration and globalization. October 13th, immigration reform. You can see what kind of reform, right? Right? November 6, 2014, diversity in suburbia. That was fascinating. I love that. For all the people who haven't seen it, you'll have to come back and do all these topics. And today's topic, sanctuary cities and universities. And for those who are not familiar with what it means, Carlos will tell you. And it's really a very sad situation. And of course, all I see when I watch the television, I want to cry, and I keep thinking to myself, what happened in Germany, and I remember thinking after the war, I was a young girl, someone knocking on the door and coming for me. So I can imagine what these young people, and I'm not talking about the mothers, I'm talking about the children, whose mothers or fathers did nothing. We're not talking about terrible people. And it's very sad, and I'm so happy that Sanctuary City, South Orange became a sanctuary city on Monday. So
I didn't know we did.
Yes, yes. So that's the good news. And meanwhile, like I said before we begin, I want to thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs. I couldn't do it without them. And now we have a lot to learn. And Carlos, I know you're such an activist, and I'm so proud to be your friend and to have you here. So please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very special guest, Carlos.
You had the list of all the folks.
Of course.
Well, thank you.
I paid very well. Coffee and cake.
Yeah. And what is it? The return on library books.
Oh.
Yeah, we worked that out. That's the private
That's supposed to be a secret.
Right. So thank you all for coming this afternoon. I imagine everybody there's a lot of information and a lot of misinformation about the whole question of sanctuary cities out there. And what I'd like to do is talk briefly about the concept of sanctuary, at least as I understand it, and some of the work we've done at Rutgers to make Rutgers into a sanctuary campus. I was very heavily involved in that effort. And what that effort is responding to, because I think that what it comes down to is, on the one hand, we understand that governments and states need to regulate who enters and leaves, who lives within their borders, et cetera, that to the degree that that's the case, that is completely understandable. At the same time, discussions about immigration in this country have become so incredibly polarized that when you listen to George W. Bush back in 2007, 2008, when there was still an immigration reform on the table, his attitude, which is a very mainstream Republican attitude towards immigrants, is miles away from where the Republican Party and from where our current government is standing in relationship to immigration. As a Texan, George W. Bush was basically talking about immigration reform as a mechanism to address labor and folks who are already in the country, right? And I think most of us will remember that there was a conversation about an immigration reform that at the time seemed to make a lot of sense, and it continued to make a lot of sense until things began to get really, really polarized with Obama. In the meantime, we all know that deportations began to escalate during the Bush-Cheney years, and they really took off with Obama. So by the time Obama was done, he had deported somewhere in the range of 400,000 people a year. And by the time the administration ended, he had deported an estimate of 2.5 million people, right? Now, we don't hear about that because the tendency to cast Obama as the big contrast with Trump, right, is part of the mainstream narrative that has made Trump more of the exception than Trump actually is. So part of we could characterize it as, I think somewhat accurately, though problematically, as the hysteria of the media over the Trump phenomena really obscures the degree to which Trump is really a continuation of a lot of the stuff that was being done by Obama. It was done, Obama was more of a class act than Trump was when it came to some of these things. And he clearly held a tighter ship when it came to leaks and those kinds of problems than our current leaker in chiefs. I'm not too sure who leaks more these days, or our Twitter president. But there was clearly a lot of what we're seeing with Trump and immigration is not so much a contrast as it is a continuation and escalation of efforts that were already ongoing. So we have to keep that in mind, because it's not, otherwise this seems completely crazy. How could this be happening? But we have to keep in mind that some of this was already going on. We were just not really discussing it. So to the degree that Trump makes very evident in a kind of crude, very open way, things that were already existing in the relationship of the U.S. state to immigrant populations, this is really a continuation and a more clear and a clearer articulation of existing dynamics. Now, one of the reasons we had about a decade's worth of conversation about an immigration reform was because of our country's addiction not only to this constant meddling in the affairs of other parts of the world, because of our own role as self-appointed leaders of the free world, etc., which in many cases has meant intervening or meddling in the businesses of other countries, which of course Trump and the people who support him want to move away from towards this more isolationist stance. So we have that issue. Immigration doesn't happen unless there is an established pattern of relationships where a country invades another, where a country intervenes in the business of the other. Immigrants don't migrate randomly. People don't just get up and decide one day, oh, I'm going to go to the U.S., right? Unless there is an established pattern of relations, which usually involves intervention in our history, particularly think about what's going on in Yemen with the crisis now. So after the so-called Muslim ban, there was that raid, and the various human rights organizations are announcing that Yemen is in a state of crisis and needs money, and that the crisis was, the U.S. had a lot to do with the current crisis, and we have a lot of displaced populations, or populations that are experiencing vulnerability to violence. And what are we going to do about those people? Because that's one of the 7 countries that's identified as a country we're no longer, that there is a stay on that particular immigration order, on that executive order. But again, we tend to make decisions about immigration, and oftentimes in the coverage of those decisions, we tend to forget to what degree we've been complicit in creating the conditions for those things to happen in the first place. And Syria is the other more, and unlike Germany, that took in about 1 million Syrian refugees, or Canada that has taken in about 30,000. We've taken a very small number of refugees, of the portion of the refugees that the rest of the world has taken in, and at this point, Syria becomes yet another problem that we want to stay away from. So there's a question of like how much are we willing to deal responsibly with circumstances that we have something to do with. I'm not saying the U.S. is always responsible for the problems that happen in other places, but to the degree that we continue to participate and lead international efforts that result in interventions of different kinds, the displacement of populations and the creation of immigrant streams, as they tend to be called when you have a wave of immigrants leaving a place and going to another, that's part of what we have to handle. So it's weird because now I look at George W. Bush, and I was never a fan back in the day, but now I am looking at him and I'm thinking, wow, you know, there was a time when Republicans were sounding like this, and I would actually have been okay with that particular tone, particularly because as a Texan, you know, and as someone who has a relationship with immigrant communities in Texas, the Bush and his family were very much aware of the contributions of immigrants. And of course, it wasn't like Bush, this was all lovey-lovey, you know, we love immigrants, etc. But at least on the level of you know, here's this labor, here are these folks who are willing to do jobs that I can't get Americans to perform, why don't we legalize them, right? We also have the problem, you know, this discussion about immigration and what are we going to do about immigrants tends to neglect the fact that there is a certain kind of labor that a lot of Americans are no longer willing to perform, right? And so what happens when people don't want to engage in agriculture is, well, those fields are still there, the land needs to be tilled, all that stuff needs to happen, who's going to do it, right? And so we run into a second problem, and by the way, this is a worldwide problem, the question of how immigrant labor begins to replace the labor of natives who are no longer willing to perform that work because they either migrated to cities or because the older generations haven't quite figured out how to train young people to actually stay in rural towns. This is an up-and-coming problem, right? We have all these small towns, and the overarching tendency of young folks is to leave and not come back. They go to cities, or they may come back to the countryside, but they're surely not as invested in making a living as a farmer, right? As older generations were. And so that becomes a problem in this country. It becomes a problem in the states that we associate with the so-called red states. But it's a problem right here in New Jersey, right? To what degree do we get the grandchildren of many of you to be convinced that agriculture is the right horizon for their lives, right? And that if they don't perform agricultural labor, somebody's going to have to do it, and we got to figure out who, right? So there's an issue here about sustainability and a challenge to all of us in terms of, you know, not only will immigrants be always the ones replacing this labor, but what do we do about generations whose orientation towards labor has nothing to do with agriculture? That, you know, somebody is gonna have to cultivate the land, and, you know, we all eat the stuff, but, you know, somebody has to, you know, raise the chickens and deal with rural labor, and this is, you know, eventually gonna become a problem. I'm really glad to hear that South Orange became a sanctuary city. Yeah, that's very exciting. I'll tell you a little bit about how this some of what's been going on manifests at the human level, because I happen to be a college professor, and so for me this is not just about some idiotic you know, cycle of back and forth on CNN with the usual Trump supporter whom everybody abhors and will always say the most inane thing or the craziest thing to justify what Trump is doing. But then we get into I don't know how many of you have watched the Saturday Night Live skit where Trump does something ever more outrageous and they all go through the same cycle. So this is unacceptable, and by the time you get to the end, we've done the same cycle. CNN has become a little bit of that kind of, you know, the little shop of horrors where you always feel like you're being just pushed to a point where there is no return, and we all realize that part of the problem with Trump is he's gonna do what he's gonna do, and being outraged is really not solving anything right now. It's not gonna solve the problem, and as long as we're stuck being outraged, we're not actually addressing the substance of the challenges in front of us. And that's what I think a lot of mainstream media doesn't get, and it's very unfortunate. So I actually trust more podcasts. I listen to a lot more to NPR than I ever thought I would, because I don't want some crazy person reacting either for or against what's going on. I just want, just report. Don't editorialize. Let me be riled up and upset, but I can deal with that. I don't need you to react for me. A lot of the corporate media these days tends to start engaging Trump from the position of outrage, and it's outrage. It's this sort of moral high ground where we all know that government, politics, politicians are two-faced liars on both sides. They're unethical, they're corrupt, they do all kinds of crazy things, and it's our job as citizens to try to figure out who has integrity and make up our minds for ourselves about who has integrity and who doesn't. So that our job as citizens has become a tougher job, because we have, I keep on saying, you'll pardon my French, how do you get through this shitstorm that we're getting all the time? I mean, it's just coming. It's coming all the time. It's very stressful, but at the same time, I'm finding that I need to make up my mind now about issues much more than I did before. I find myself listening to Fox a lot more, not only because I really need to hear that other side, but also because when I hear somebody like Chris Wallace, there are certain things that will come through in his work, and even O'Reilly, whom I don't particularly like either, but there are certain opinions where I'm like, you know what? Maybe that's really not so crazy. And though I think that the majority of what some of these folks say is stuff that you really have to take with a grain of salt, but so are some of the things that people say on the other side. The whole Ivanka Trump and Justin Trudeau, like, people need to stop. Like, okay, she may have been, somebody said to me, and she was staring at him with such a hungry look, and I started laughing, right? And so I was having, and I'm like, well, maybe she is hungry. But the thing is, why do we make such a fuss about such little insignificant things? Who cares? I sincerely hope Ivanka gets it whenever she can, but it really is none of my business. I'm more concerned about what is going on with Ivanka's clothes and this whole business about Trump supporting the Nordstrom. That whole morass of conflict of interest stuff is way more interesting to me than who Ivanka is looking at with a leering, I mean, it's a little bit like lurid Hollywood, like B category crap. Who needs that? But we have, that's part of the stuff that we have to weed out of our consciousness. So there's been a sanctuary movement, and sanctuaries are generally cast as spaces of protection, right? And the sanctuary movement has been alive in the United States for a long time, before we ever had anything called sanctuary cities. And in fact, there were some movements to make churches into sanctuaries way before, during the civil rights era and then later, but then definitely during the Obama era. People will remember that there was a woman, I remember several years ago, there was a woman who was held in an Illinois church for several months, and I think that there was the case of the other woman you were mentioning, Phyllis, where the sanctuary became a little bit like when you go into the embassy and you become you fall under the protectorate of the church. Sanctuary embassies have been, as we know, a sanctuary of sorts, particularly for sort of political prisoners. Julian Assange is perhaps the most famous case that we can probably think about, but there are other cases. Now, the sanctuary city movement has been growing and developing as a response to the very clear attacks of the Trump campaign and Trump in particular towards immigrants. And folks already felt the weight of this way before the election actually happened, or the election came through the way it did. I think that a lot of what we're experiencing now is an escalation, again, of processes that were already underway. And so right after Trump won, November 9th, I had a niece, like a lot of people, I didn't really believe this was happening, and so I'm sort of staring at the TV, and my niece, who's 18, who's from the Dominican Republic, who's here as a student on a student visa, gets really upset, and she looks at me, and she's like this, proto-feminist, very proud Afro-Dominican woman. She looks at me and she's like, but he's a sexual predator. And I said, you know what, just go to bed. Like, I can't even deal, because I couldn't even deal with like what I was seeing, right? And I'm like, just go to bed, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And then I had just come from teaching. I had taught that night, and when I came out at it was around 7:30, they had already called Kentucky and another red state, I can't remember, the two first that were called, and then there was another one that was a blue, like one of the Vermont or one of those states that was called, those were the first states that were called. I go into the Barnes & Noble in New Brunswick, which is a majority Latino city, but not exactly where Rutgers is. So, like I'm in a terrain that I kind of understand, and I walk in, there's an African-American woman sitting at the big table at the Barnes & Noble, and she's sort of looking at the screen of her computer, and she's like, she looks really panicked. And I kind of look at her, and she looks at me, and I said, oh no, those, they're always gonna call those for the Republicans, that's fine. And she looks at me, and she's like, the two of them, they no good, neither one of them. And I said, right, but he's really a lot worse than she is. And the moment, we're having this moment of denial, right? And it's really funny because that was the way the whole night went. So I was in bed watching CNN and watching some of these other, and my husband just kept on refusing. He was very sleepy, so he kept on like not really reacting, and I said, he's winning, and 10, 11, the votes are coming in, and this is just not looking good. And when I saw that Virginia was a struggle, I was like, what, how is this even possible? So you all remember that gap between, it must have been the last hour and a half where the final votes were not coming in. The West Coast the blue wall on the West had just come through, but we didn't know what was going on with the Rust Belt states. And then they just kept on talking, and Chris Matthews and Rachel, whatever her name, Maddow, and everybody, they were just going at it, and I just fell asleep. And then he woke me up. And he was looking at this like, he won. And I said, I've been telling you that for the last 5 hours, right? He finally woke up as Trump is giving his acceptance speech. So next day, and of course I'm, like walking like a wounded dog the next day, totally not useful to myself or to anyone else, and it was like somebody had died. And then my niece, we're all trying to make sense of what happened, and I get an email. I receive an email from a student who's a DACA recipient. What is it? The delayed action for, there are two programs that were put together by President Obama. Since you all remember, Obama had a really hard time getting any immigration to go through. He set up, it's deferred action for childhood arrivals, and and DAPA, which is deferred action for parental arrivals. So it's something like that. These are programs that give a minimum of legality to children of immigrants who happen to, non-US born children of immigrants who arrived in the US at an age where, like they were 5 years old, 10 years old, or whatever. So through no action of their own, but the fact that their parents crossed the border or overstayed their visas, they are put in this position of being undocumented. So I get an email from a student who's a grad student at Rutgers. And she's like, I don't know, why is my department not reacting? I'm wondering if there's anything we can do. I'm really terrified. I'm concerned about my mother. I'm concerned about my sister. And I'm supposed to be studying, but I can't think about studying when I have to worry so much about everybody around me. And I'm mentioning her because it's someone just wrote to me about her this morning, telling me that they're really concerned about her and that she's not really, that she's in trouble. But the issue here is not just that, can you do the work, and how can you do the work when your very presence is a question, right? And it's a very urgent question. And so I said to her, she said, well, why is my department not reacting? And I said, okay, listen, don't take it personally. This has been really hard on everybody. Don't take it personally, just go and ask the question. Because you don't know where other people are standing on all of these issues. But we have the urgency of having to respond to you. Eventually, we organized a rally at Rutgers, and it was a big rally right after Trump. It was one of we're a big rally, like 2,000 people. For New Brunswick, it's a big deal, believe me. If you have like 2,000 people in New Brunswick rallying, it's a big thing. And then we organized a petition as a response to the concern and the alarm, not just of DACA recipients and undocumented. These are people who have a permit to live and work in the U.S. it's usually about a 2-year period. And the idea was that it would be, by the time that time period expired, there would be some kind of path to citizenship, or there would be a renewal. And right now, we don't know what Trump is going to do about this. This is one of the parts of the executive action that hasn't yet been brought to to a resolution, if you will. And as we know, as you have probably heard, he's extremely tough on immigrant populations, but this particular kind of immigrant, he hasn't touched directly yet, right? These are not kids. Well, no, he did recently. There was not Trump directly. There was a student, a DACA recipient, who was incarcerated. And the issue is whether the kid is or isn't a gang member. And there's this whole discussion. Apparently, he never claimed gang membership, but there's suspicion that he might be a member of a gang. And so it becomes a different kind of discussion. This is not just a student. But most DACA recipients are regular kids who are going to school. And many DACA recipients are going to different, we may have some at Seton Hall. We certainly have many at Rutgers, New Brunswick. So we moved to, we put together a petition to take it to our president, President Barchi at Rutgers. And it was a petition that was circulating at universities throughout the country to make Rutgers into a sanctuary campus, right? A little bit analogous to the sanctuary city petition. Those sanctuary cities generally, and the term sanctuary city or sanctuary campus refers specifically to what extent is the institution, be it the city or the municipality or the university, going to cooperate with the feds in putting forward information about whoever is undocumented among the folks who live in the city or the folks enrolled at the university. There are a lot of legal barriers already in place at universities that would actually make it rather difficult for anyone to just sort of say, oh, can you give me information about who your students are? In fact, you're not, if you're the parent of a student and you call me as a student, as the parent of a student I have, number one, I would tell you, I don't know who you are. I can't really talk to you. Number two, I would need to have the student contact me directly, because this is not a conversation I'm having with mom and dad about a student. Well, imagine how much of this gets amplified when it comes to an issue of an agency trying to kind of poke around and go on a fishing expedition and figure out which one of the students is undocumented or not. So there are some legal barriers in place, and the idea of sanctuary cities and sanctuary campuses, though they're not one and the same thing, in the case of sanctuary campuses, the idea is really to generate a sense that, at least to offer students a sense that the university is not going to be actively contributing towards their persecution, unless there's a subpoena or there is some kind of criminal investigation, which may be one of the very few circumstances under which certain information may be tendered to the authorities. But this is what would happen with any student at any university. So this is not, out of the ordinary. Of course, there are other things that a sanctuary campus offers, and these have been articulated explicitly. Things like mental health services or assistance in terms of legal clinics where students can go and seek some advice on what they might be able to do. And in some cases, there may be some support for, different things that students may need. We have a lot of undocumented students who have, I was at a panel yesterday where they were talking about depression and, being 18, trying to get through coursework and having to deal with all of this other stuff that's going on around you can be really rough on anyone, let alone somebody who's not, who's concerned, who has spent most of their lives concerned about their status in the country the only country that they kind of know well, because in many cases this is what many of these kids don't really have a connection to whatever the homeland is for mom and dad, simply because they've been here for so long. So one of the challenges that we face, and I don't know if you've noticed, but you have Trump seems to be interestingly he's a lot more flexible than some of the people around him are. He's not a traditional Republican. He does seem to move around and is willing to shift positions, as we saw yesterday with the whole Netanyahu moment, and God knows where that's going to go, because he may change his mind today or tomorrow about it. 1 state, 2 state, 3 state. By the time we're done, we'll have and he talks about it like he can just joke about this, and it's like, dude, like, stop it. This is state stuff, and you don't play with Israel, and you definitely do not play with the whole series of area interests that are involved in this. So if you're it's not like, oh, whatever the two of you want. This is not Celebrity Apprentice. Again, it's like, that's not what this is. These are serious problems with very serious consequences. It's a little bit like when Flynn put Iran on notice last week. I'm like, on notice of what? That you need to do your laundry? That's what you need? What? Oh, we're putting Iran officially on notice. Are you threatening war? Is that what? Because it wasn't even clear that that's what he was saying. And so the issue here seems to be that Stephen Miller, whom you probably all saw in the Sunday shows, is more of a straight up ideologue, and Bannon, who never speaks but always acts, right? So a lot of the people around Trump are actually ideologically much more rigid than Trump himself might be. And given the way he seems to operate, he seems to do what he wants no matter what these people around him want him to do. So chances are some of this may shift in the coming months, depending on what the judges ultimately do with the so-called ban. They don't seem to, they're so caught up in the Flynn scandal that I don't think they can do Flynn and Muslim ban in the same moment. They're too busy putting out that fire. But when we go back to the question of whether this ban is going to stand or be rejected, we'll see what may transpire. New York, LA, San Francisco, some of the big sanctuary cities are already facing the challenge of federal, intrusion or intervention. And I think the number as of a few days ago was 600 people who have been deported. And in some cases, they're going straight, there are these raids that people are talking about. This is alarming, but frankly, this is also part of the same set of processes that were already underway. So to what degree is the outrage being brought out because Trump is the one spearheading this, or that this is something that may be the responsibility of the new administration? And to what degree that may be hypocritical because this was already going on before? I mean, the rating is perhaps a little more spectacular than what we have been doing, under Obama. But again, it just seems like these processes, so much of what is going on has already been ongoing, that what part of the challenge for many of us is to parse out what is the new and what is the already existing from what we're seeing. So we collected, we did a petition, we collected almost 4,000 signatures, and we took a bunch of students and faculty went to the Board of Governors meeting back in, it was in December, early December. We took them to the president of the university, who was unwilling to use the word sanctuary campus for Rutgers because he thought it was a legally vague term. And he preferred to use the term safe haven. And I was like, okay, well, so that's more legally precise, okay? You think so? The students were not having this though. And so some of these undocumented kids are very, the DREAM Act, activists, the so-called dreamers, these are many of these undocumented and students who have otherwise been participants in the DACA program, have politicized themselves and have become very, very active on college campuses. So some of them were leading the parade, if you will, to the meeting of the Board of Governors, where everybody's spiffed up and like all these suits and a lot of formality. So I came to present the petition to have our university designated as a sanctuary campus. And then a young woman from the Newark campus stood up and basically said to the university president, this is not really a rhetorical question. This is what I want to know, what are you going to do if these people come and take me away? What are you going to do? Are we a sanctuary or are we not a sanctuary? Like, this is not a morally ambiguous question. And he's like, the Board of Governors, if you've participated in these high-level things, they're like, oh, we're not in the habit of responding to questions from the audience, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I'm not leaving until you answer my question. And so they were like, the President Barchi was, his response was, oh, well, I'm going to break protocol and respond to this young woman to say that, we will protect you, blah, blah, blah. And he gave it some, and this is speech that already went through legal, that is perfectly like, that is not going to get Rutgers in trouble. And that's the problem that leadership is facing. Like, how do you actually do this in a way that doesn't get your university defunded? I mean, because there are real consequences to the sanctuary city movement or sanctuary campus movement. And so she said, you're not, are we a sanctuary or are we not a sanctuary? He refused to respond, and that's when they started chanting. And they chanted until the meeting ended. They had to end the meeting because they just were not letting the meeting continue. Next day, there was a revision of the university position on this whole sanctuary question. And the position was that Rutgers will always be a sanctuary. So they just weren't using this sort of sanctuary campus language. But they use the language that's very similar to the language used by Columbia, by UC Berkeley, and by some of the other peer schools, which have been recently under attack by the likes of Milo Yiannopoulos, and the Breitbart folks have been attacking them precisely because they've come out in support of immigrant students. So what has happened so far is that Trump has not directed his ire to sanctuary campuses, but it is very clear that sanctuary cities have already begun to have back and forths with the Trump administration. What's at stake in that fight? Usually I was hearing something about this related to San Francisco and other cities out in the West Coast. There is this whole threat, oh, we're going to withdraw funding from your city, right? And that's the big threat. We will take funding away, we will not give you funds, blah, blah, blah. And what some of these folks are saying is, well, you're not withdrawing money from us that the people of this city haven't paid. The taxpayers of the city of LA or whatever. So you may be threatening to withdraw funding, but let's try to figure out exactly what we're talking about here, because it's not as if you are a patron of the municipalities that is refusing to, don your patronage. It's more like you are refusing to give us back some of our hard-earned taxpayer dollars. And so that the issue becomes not just the immigrant situation, which is a real issue, but the question of what happens with our relationship of kind of local control and big government, right? Which goes back to the heart of the whole Republican Democratic fight. Do we have big government? Do we have small government? And suddenly you have a Republican president wanting to act like big government and wanting to withdraw power from local control, right? At a moment when folks at the local level are simply saying, you're so, you're acting in such a bigoted way that we refuse to, this is not who the people in this particular municipality are, and we're just not going to abide by this. Now, there are a lot of different opinions on all sides of this issue, and I will end by saying that, or I will close by saying that we have a long way to go in this discussion. I think it's very sad that for a nation of immigrants, right, everybody in this country, with the exception of Native Americans, and Native Americans is an immigrant. So it just seems so sad that we would go to something that is so integral to who we are as a people. To have this issue divide us in this historical moment is really sad. At the same time, I must say, I am actually glad that enough people are pissed, that people are taking to the streets, and that people are starting to manifest how they really feel about these issues on all sides of the matter, because we did enter a period where there was there was a lot of complacency around these problems. 2.5 million people deported is not acceptable, right? Why have we not had a discussion about what this means? Yes, a lot of those people who were deported are probably justifiably deported. But there are a lot of those people who were swept under the rug of those particular measures that probably would have been spared this had, had more of us been involved in trying to see, okay, so what exactly happened? Did you have a ticket that you didn't pay, and is that why you're getting deported, right? Or did you kill somebody? Because that's the kind of situation that we have in some environments. When you're an 18-year-old who's caught with possessing with intent to deliver, which is a charge, right? And then you go to jail and you pay whatever. At age 18, if you're dealing drugs, not smoking, just dealing, or shooting, not just dealing drugs, these are kids. And so the punishment becomes not only that you go to jail for a few years to pay for your offense, but then you're deported. There is no recourse for you to use. And I'm saying this because my family experienced precisely this situation. I have a brother who was deported during the Clinton years. Because when Clinton did the Immigration Reform Act of '96, that Immigration Reform Act had erased a provision that existed in immigration law, which allowed folks who had committed offenses that were non-criminal, like civil misdemeanors, the opportunity to obtain a pardon, provided that their immediate relatives would provide an affidavit, say you're going back to, you have no family back there. Well, so Janet Reno, many of you will probably remember Janet Reno. When this whole thing happened, there was a question of whether Reno would apply it retroactively, because my brother committed his offense in '95 or '94. It was before this law went into effect. That sort of lingered for a while until she decided that yes, it would be applied retroactively. And my brother was deported. My brother has now lived in the Dominican Republic since forever, the last 15 years or so. So imagine, and that was an offense that arguably, we could say, well, yeah, but what was he caught with? And, you don't really forgive that, blah, blah, blah. And we all have, we may have our opinions around questions of drug possession. But a lot of the people who were deported in this, 2.5 million who were deported under Obama, were being deported for things that were much less of a concern to society than possessing drugs when you're 18 and you don't really know what you're doing. So to the degree that we can make others more aware of the complexities of these issues, I think we will be doing all of us and all of our neighbors a better service than simply to just sort of watch the pundits on the media just go berserk, and go berserk over something that is part of a political climate that Donald Trump didn't invent, right? The political climate we're in. We are dealing with somebody who has they should have a shrink in the White House, but the issues that what brought him there. Those concerns are very legitimate, and the way that our country, our society has been polarized is a larger problem that will outlive Trump, right? So we're still gonna have to figure out how to do this. So I'll shut up now, and I look forward to questions.
You were wonderful.
Thank you.
An overview of everything. I have one question.
Yes.
Okay. The cities that are being called sanctuary cities, they not only have a lot of immigrants, they have a lot of poverty. You take Newark and East Orange that are saying they're sanctuary cities, it's very frightening to think that a budget would be cut from their budget when they don't have enough pencils for the kids in school,
Right.
in some of their schools. So at what point are they going to cut the budget?
It's a big question.
San Francisco and LA, there's enough tax wealthy.
Mhm.
They have poor areas too.
What?
They have poor areas in LA too.
They do, but there is enough money to subsidize others. But
I think we're gonna have to see how this works out in practice, because you can grandstand all you want, but we all know, people remember what a disaster it was to get through Newark last year when we had the 2 feet of snow event. Was it 2 years ago?
Yes.
That was a nightmare. You could not get through Newark in in less than 2.5 hours or whatever. And I just kept on thinking, what is wrong with the city that they can't? And so imagine if they take money away from that.
That's what I was thinking.
Where are the reserves?
Yeah.
How do cities like Newark, where is their revenue coming from? I think some of the question of where the weight of federal action or federal withdrawal of funds will be felt is really in the programs that are subsidized most directly by the feds. So education will probably suffer.
That's exactly the worst place.
And the tax base of a place like, because we have home rule, but we have, the county seat for Essex, isn't it Newark?
Yeah.
It's Newark, so a lot of the resources of the suburbs, actually, there's a portion of it that flows back to Newark, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think that's how it works,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
So I would think that, Baraka and the other mayors will probably have to think about what is it that, what would be essential services that are provided by the feds that they would have to supplement. And, we all know that now with our wonderful Secretary of Education, who's never been to a public school, and,
Oh, we don't have to worry about grizzly bears.
No, we will, because the kids will all have guns, so.
Okay.
Yeah, so the thing about this is it'll be interesting to see where the federal budget, the federal resources hit. And if they're withdrawn, what would be the areas? Because some of the roads might be some of the problems, but they haven't even been able to. This is apparently a bipartisan consensus issue that Trump is interested in infrastructure, which is great for labor. It's great for, and the Democrats agree. The Republicans don't like this because the Republicans don't like to spend money. But apparently that was a point of agreement. They haven't gotten to that because they're dealing with whatever it is that's going on today. I mean, somebody's head may roll by the end of today. You just walk away from the media for 2 hours and somebody resigns,
Right.
something's leaked, something is happening. So it's like, so I would say we need to see how this turns out, how this works out. De Blasio has been, for example, in New York, very vocal, but he's also not the most popular mayor out there either. So he's having this, people are even talking about Hillary Clinton. She should just move on, but personally, but I can have a whole 3-hour thing about Hillary Clinton.
You'll come back.
Because it's no, just move on. This whole dynastic families, we need to move on. People just need to, you're already rich, you're already whatever, you don't need any more. Just move on. Let then some new blood come in. And I really think that, the ills of, as much as we may say about the Republicans, the Democrats have a big problem. And it's a party machinery that is extremely problematic and leaves no room for new people, new blood, new ideas. And so, if we could keep Bernie on for another 20 years, I'm really a Bernie Democrat. But part of the side that my sympathy with Bernie lies in the sense that he really wants to push the party to have integrity. And it's been a problem with the the Democratic Party. For all the reasons that we know, WikiLeaks and everything else, we've definitely seen that whatever we may say about the Republicans, we know the Democrats are not in a better place at the level of how they do politics. So, I'm ready for a third party.
Maureen Dowd said it all on Sunday, I don't know if you know. She said, we owe it to Trump to bring out all the things that were underlying.
Yeah,
And that-
yeah, it's all up there.
That people are now, going to these town hall meetings and mobilizing.
Yeah, and people need to be pissed, and we need to hold our politicians accountable, because that's what being an engaged citizen should be about. And I just don't believe these people for a minute. And when what they did to Chaffetz, that then, then he was saying that it was, planted liberal pundits in Utah. Those people didn't look liberal to me. They were really pissed at him. It's like, dude, you're basically selling our land. And the people of Utah are really concerned about issues with land, the land takeovers by private corporations, etc. Ring a bell. People are just sick and tired of having billionaires take over and run our lives as if our lives didn't matter simply because we live on fixed income or whatever the issue is for us. So.
Or ignorance, like fracking is that.
Right, right. It's a big thing in Utah. Yeah. So, other questions? Yeah.
I understand that there are cases where we deport someone, but nobody is willing to take the person back. Suppose we could get an area, say in Mexico, where the government decided that you can't send us anyone who hasn't been convicted of a serious crime. Would that work?
Well, like Peña Nieto, this is another Saturday Night Live skit where, he's like.
I'm not talking about the hard criminals. I'm talking about the woman who has to leave her children in the States.
Well, I think that.
Could you repeat the question so that?
Well, actually, can you rephrase the question? Can you repeat it? Because there is a part of it that I missed.
I understand that there are cases where the United States has tried to deport someone,
Right.
but the country will not take them back.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way possibly to consider that maybe, say, for example, a state of Mexico,
Mhm.
where they would say, you can't send this person back to us because the person has not committed a serious crime?
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible?
Well, I think they've tried it. I can, I know the cases in the Dominican Republic where people are deported. The deportations sometimes, we call it deportations, but there are different kinds of that kind of thing. So the deportation can be that you're ousted forcibly, so you're, there may be a raid and you're put back, you're put on a plane to return. There may be a case where you are trying to come into the US and you're rejected and sent back, right? Those are
Talking
becoming,
about that.
right, those are more frequent. But the cases where you send people back, the thing about accepting them is if you're a national of that country, the idea is that the country will have to accept you, right? And I think in most cases that is what happens. So that is what happens, and people, I haven't heard too much, and perhaps this is my own ignorance, of people who are left in a legal limbo because, say, the US doesn't want them, but Mexico doesn't want them either, and they're left somewhere in between. I do know that there are cases where this has happened with refugees. The most famous case is the Refugee Island, this whole issue with Australia. You'll remember the call with Australia that was a week ago. I was gonna say a few years ago. A week ago, Australia has a refugee camp, I wanna say. It's an island that they've devoted to some of these refugee populations, and they have been denounced by Human Rights Watch and other groups for the conditions under which they have held the refugees. So when the Prime Minister of Australia was talking to Trump about the fact that the US was going to take the 1,250 refugees, he was talking about refugees in this island. People who are being held and they're held in a state of limbo, like legal limbo, because they're, that's one of the cases that I'm more familiar with. I haven't heard too much of, we may actually hear more of situations in which something like what you're outlining comes up. because it will probably surface very soon. However, other countries tend to, countries like Mexico, even the Dominican Republic that I'm very familiar with, countries in Central America tend to absorb. What they do when folks are deported is they, I don't know if we even have that practice in the US, but when they do a profile. So when you come in and they know that you have a criminal offense or whatever the offense is, you're registered with the police as someone who was deported in that country, and that stays with you. That it's like the Scarlet A, like that stays with you for a very long time. So my brother, for example, it took him a good decade to get rid of that mark, because then when you're going to go to get a job, people will say not only did you go to jail, which is already stigmatizing, but you were also deported. So that's what my sense is that some of these societies where people are deported will take them back, but not without further exacerbating the criminalization. And some of it may be warranted. I mean, if you go back and you committed some awful crime, the other government probably wants to know what it was. But in many cases, the folks who are being deported are not necessarily the ones who, not all of them are facing, accusations or having fulfilled sentences for horrible crimes. Yeah.
I still don't understand one thing. South Orange becomes a sanctuary city. What are we, as a city, doing to this people?
That's a good question. What are we as a city doing for these people, fellas?
We're meeting.
We're meeting.
I mean, once there's conversation and meetings, it's
My-
a beginning.
My husband asked me about whether because he was driving me here. He's like, so South Orange. So I was very pleasantly, because this is not a big issue here. I didn't think that it was a big issue in South Orange. I figured West Orange would probably have more of or Orange, and West Orange would have more of a concern.
We have Seton Hall, and Seton Hall has immigrants.
Right, so perhaps that's what we are. I would be very interested in seeing what the town would want to do. In general, sanctuary cities offer some services, as in like legal services, legal counsel, making some of that available free of charge to people, which would be a big help, because a lot of immigrants just want to know what can they do, and not just folks who are undocumented, people who are immigrants, like people with green cards, and want to know, can I leave the country, like under what circumstances would this leaving and coming back be a problem for me?
All right, so in South Orange, where do they go? Anybody who needs that information, they go to
They have
town
a
hall?
hall, they have a full town hall.
They go
They-
to town hall?
I
Or
would,
what town hall? That's another thing. You go to town hall, there's a secretary says, oh, I don't know. Yeah,
yeah, I think that, yeah, our town is not that user-friendly. I mean, the few times I've gone, I mean, people are good at telling me where I need to go to get certain things, but it's not self-evident, right? So.
I think they should go to the reference librarian upstairs who will.
And actually, remember, Phyllis, when I had
I am not the reference librarian.
when I started living in this town, I think I came to the library too, because I had some like family things that I needed
We
to.
always
That
have
was
that.
my first stop.
I'm just telling you the truth. There isn't anyone who doesn't come into the library that doesn't get help.
right, that's a
And friendly help, and
That was
without
good.
people rolling their eyes.
I think that's really.
That's a very.
I actually think the town should invest more in the libraries, and I actually think this town should invest in beefing up the stuff that you guys have upstairs. We should have more books, we should have better technology. We should invest in the libraries, and we should have people who are bilingual. So if you are really invested in being Sanctuary City, to have somebody who's bilingual and available to support folks who might come in the door. And I actually think this is a very friendly, welcoming library, but
Absolutely.
if we wanted to make it, to step it up, given that perhaps we're not a town that has a, majority immigrant population, but for immigrants to kind of know that they're welcome, where would they go? The library is the logical, and I see a lot of folks who are immigrants who are coming in here,
That's
so.
why Sandy's work and the Friends,
We
when
are
people
trying,
contribute,
we really
we
are,
really
and I
do
hear you
try.
loud and clear.
Yeah.
My first stop when I moved to New Jersey was the library.
Yeah.
The very first stop. And Phyllis was there. for
And
me.
especially in a town like this where there is a little bit of a not there with the town, with the town hall, because it took me a while to figure out where the freaking place was, right? But I always knew where the library
That's
was.
right.
Because I usually figure that out first, because I'm a library host, so I'm gonna go and borrow a book and whatever, so that whole thing to me is what makes me, become interested in
I've been
it.
here 31 years, I feel like it's my town, I live in Springfield, but, I know a few years ago, there was a problem with mold in Orange Library. And one of the women who worked there came to work part-time with us, Mary. And boy, I found out things that, first of all, when there was mold and they got money from the government, somewhere along the line, some of the money disappeared.
Right,
And now you're hurting the very essence of the poor kids who don't have a good library in their school,
Right.
who have to come here. And of course, we opened it up to everyone and so that they could take out books and
Right.
everything. If we didn't, they really would have been no place. That's
Right.
why.
and this
So-
library, I remember when Sandy hit, people will remember this, and most of the town had no electricity.
Right.
The library was available and people
Exactly.
came here. And I think it was after that, somebody must have donated because suddenly there were more outlets upstairs. And I came back and I'm like, okay, so this is how you see that people are. And I think that we can never be grateful enough for a library. This is a free space.
Right.
We live in an economy where if you don't go and spend $3 on a coffee, you can't sit down in a lot of places. And that's actually a disgrace for most of us working people who, all we really want is a place to go be able to curl up with a book.
Well said.
Those of us who still read a book, and,
Absolutely.
even when we're reading iPads, having nice free access to a space of quiet, which is what I see people accessing when they come up here, is really important, so.
Well, that's the
Well
one thing we
said,
don't,
well said.
unfortunately. We don't have a quiet space, because we don't have enough space to have a quiet space.
Yeah, well, maybe we need to build.
That's the whole secret, that's what we're going to try to
Thank you
do.
very, very much.
You're welcome. And if you ever want somebody to go fundraise for the libraries, I'm there, I'm your man.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you.
I'm a total,
Okay, I'll remember
I
that.
am like really committed to libraries, so.
Well, I want you to know I made phone calls for the Friends of Reno, and I cannot tell you that the response was so wonderful, so thank you very
Yeah,
much.
absolutely.
Thank you.
So just so you know, in the time period that we've been talking, Trump
meet
has
you
appointed
there.
his first Latino cabinet minister.
Oh, yes.
Wow, I wanted to-
Yes,
So,
and a guy connected with the National Labor Relations
It's
Board.
the new country work, but country workers, right?
It's the first Latino, his first Latino person.
Okay,
Wow.
okay, thank you.
So, I mean, he likes his Hispanics, you know.
They can stay.
It was a whole boatload of World War II, where they couldn't come to the US. And they had
I didn't
to
want
go
to ask
back.
them because
And I don't ever know what happened to those people.
I'll tell you,
I know, we all know, well, we know that one of them was Jared Kushner's grandmother, who was eventually led into the US. But if you look up NPR, there is a whole podcast, I can't remember which show it was, about Jared Kushner's grandmother, who was precisely among the generation of Jews who were not allowed in at that generation, and they were allowed in later.
I had a speaker here who told us about it, and who said that that boat was supposed to go to Cuba, and at the last minute, the Cuban president said, we don't want them. So they divided up all those people on the ship, and some went to one country, one to the only ones who survived were the ones who went to Britain. That was just a stroke of luck,
Yeah.
because at the time that they were dividing it up, not all of the countries
Yeah,
were under German occupation.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
So, in any case,
I would say
one
one
last
of the
question.
major aspects
Phyllis,
of sanctuary.
What ship are you talking about?
Excuse me.
During the war?
Yes.
It was mentioned in the Times.
Go ahead.
One of the major aspects of sanctuary, and the South Orange Police Department agrees, is that the police will not help
Right.
when the immigration officials come in, and that's how they're protected, is what we will not do to them.
Mhm.
They will not help who?
The feds, the ICE.
The, the police department will not help the feds, and.
Because as you know, in the whole immigration debate, that's been a huge point of contention. To what degree does the local police collaborate with federal authorities when it comes to these kinds of things? Police folks and even watchdog groups agree that policing is really about a relationship of community that you want to establish, right? And when people know that you will basically pass on information about them to another agency that may mean, that you'll be deported or removed, that hurts community police relations, right? And, as much work as we need to do to reform the police in this country and to reform or to rethink police-community relations in this country, to put us in a position where immigrants are afraid of the police because they could be, this could mean direct line into being deported is just adding salt to an already really bad wound that we all have. So that's another
Yeah,
key
this way,
principle.
hopefully they would not be afraid to come forward if they are
Right.
aware of a crime
Right.
and can help identify.
Right.
Then they don't have to be worried about being deported.
Employers, so employers can threaten people with, or steal people's wages and threaten them with deportation. So if I can go to the police and say, so-and-so hasn't paid my wages,
Right.
it should not matter whether I'm documented or not. If you owe me wages, you owe me wages. Issues of domestic violence, that's yet another area where people would really hesitate to say anything. And we all know that victims of domestic violence are already disproportionately, they disproportionately experience all kinds of barriers to actually articulating that this is happening to them. So imagine thinking that I may get myself deported or get somebody else deported, would compound the obstacle.
No, in-
On that same point,
One last question.
if they are afraid that they will be deported if they go to the police, that makes all of those immigrants, legal and unlegal, afraid, subject to victimization, not only by employers, but, all kinds of criminal activity
Right.
that can be imposed on them with impunity.
Yeah, they've got the ability to, when you think about, the whole question with Posner and his anti-labor record, right? And his complete disdain of working people. Just to know that this person was gonna run the Department of
It's a good
Labor, it's
thing.
like a nightmare for
Resign.
everybody. And I do think that part of the challenge before us is figuring out, okay, so perhaps the immigration discussion writ large is a discussion we need to continue to have, but to the degree that we can support folks in really having, their dignity not stolen while they are in our midst, that is something worthy of the fight for all of us. I'm really pleased that we're doing it in this town, and I guess we'll have to see how things pan out in the coming months, because I think that we will see where this goes very soon. In fact, we may see it as soon as the coming weeks, given the fact that Trump is about to issue another executive order.
Another breaking news.
Right. We'll definitely be on the
We did
lookout.
have one
Thank you
trustee
all
that
for
was
coming.